Over the last year, I've done so many short form portfolio roasts on TikTok and Instagram. And so today I thought I would change it up and do a long form one where I dive into one portfolio in as much detail as possible. We're going to be looking at this portfolio right here. So, whenever I open a portfolio for the first time, I try to assess for the visual design skills first. Typically, I'll scroll through really quickly to get an overview of what to expect. So, at a glance, I think this person is kind of borderline. So, they have some aspects of good visual design, but some of it feels like not super polished. And so I wanted to call out a few examples of what I mean. The first small thing that I noticed is that this header area is pretty close to the global navigation. And because of that, this entire area up here feels extremely cramped. And so if I were to adjust this, I would definitely add more spacing up here. So I eyeballed it, but maybe something like this. The next thing is that the left and right sides of the page where the margins are should be even. And right now I'm noticing that there are quite a few points on the left side that aren't aligned. So like I should be able to draw a line from here to here and everything should be lined up next to each other. I think the details like that are really important because it showcases how much attention to detail this designer has. For example, down here as well, the icons are not aligned to the left and right sides of the page. The next thing I notice is that they changed the font here to match the app that they are working on. Highly recommend against doing that. I think although it does match the app that you worked on, it makes the entire page itself feel inconsistent. And so I would stick with the headings that you have here. Let's talk a little bit about the project. So one thing I'm noticing is that there's this use of like a rotated phone screen, and it actually makes the design feel smushed. I think because the perspective is off, I highly recommend against using rotated phone screens. Instead, use front facing ones. They're a lot easier to manage, and then I can actually see the work that you did. Onto the design work itself. So I think elements of it are good, but the one thing I'm noticing is that the use of drop shadows across all your work is kind of making it seem a little bit more dated than maybe is intentional. And so highly recommend either removing the drop shadow completely or making it a lot fainter and a lot more kind of like ambient. I think this one here is especially harsh. I noticed another one, I think down here, these also have shadows as well. And then these cards also have shadows as well, especially when you're using a black shadow on top of a colored background. It can really stand out in a negative way. And so, highly recommend maybe if you have the time to go through and modify the design slightly. Like, for example, this one here feels a little bit more modern because there are no shadows. So, I'm going to dive into this first case study here, Seeds. Before I dive into it, I wanted to call a few things about the sentences written here. I think these sentences are one of the only sentences people are going to read in your portfolio. And so, highly recommend editing it and try not to do anything too fancy. So, for example, here, echoing self growth through gamified New Year resolutions. The word echoing doesn't really make much sense to me here. You could probably get away with gamified New Year's resolutions or self growth through gamified New Year's resolutions. I think that describes your project enough. Secondly, here, a project that I worked on with developers. This call out here is really confusing to me. I am not sure if you like found some friends and are working on this project together. And so I think more context there would be useful. Like, did you get hired to work on this? Where did these developers come from? I think this right now is showing that you're a little bit more entry level than maybe you want to seem, because a lot of times entry level people feel the need to explicitly called out that they worked with developers. And so just something to think about. Then, secondly, this sentence here, I anchored, the word anchored is also kind of random. And so I'd highly recommend maybe removing the sentence because I don't think it adds that much, or focus more on the fact that you're using habit retention research to design the app. Okay, so onto the case study. So, something I'm noticing immediately is that there is not a strong type hierarchy at the top of the page. These two are kind of clashing for attention, or they're competing for attention. And so, I would either make seeds smaller like this, or I would reverse it and make echoing self growth smaller, make seeds bigger. I think right now it's unclear to me which one you want me to focus on. Looking at these designs here, I can already learn a lot. Unfortunately, I'd probably not continue reviewing this portfolio based on these designs alone. One thing I'm noticing is that, first of all, there's this use of like a smushed iPhone screen. So it looks like this design is smushed because the phone is rotated, but it's not at the right perspective. So it looks like a mistake. Again, highly recommend using front facing screens instead. One thing that I immediately noticed is that there are a bunch of different card styles here. So there's this like white card, there's this gray card, and there's orange card. And looking at that, it makes the app feel really inconsistent because I don't think there's a need to have all three cards, especially if you use a colorful card like this orange card. Sometimes the design can feel a lot more dated because if you open up any app in the App Store, the use of like a orange colored card or any sort of like color that's not neutral is pretty rare. And so typically only see stuff like this in student projects. The next thing I'm noticing is that these cards here are, I would say, could use improvement. So right now, like the text is all aligned in the center, which makes it a little bit harder to read. There's a use of italics. Typically, you won't need to use sans serif italics. They don't really add much to the type hierarchy. Usually when I see cards like this, the text is left aligned and then the card here, so the three things here are usually structured in a different way. And so if you have the time, I highly recommend doing some research to see how cards are designed across other apps. You might not even need the view button. A lot of times people will add unnecessary buttons to iOS apps, but people assume that things are tappable on iPhone apps. And so you probably don't need to put the view button. It makes it feel really it feels a little bit more dated with the view button because most people will know to tap things when they're on their phone. I think my biggest piece of feedback with this card is there's a lack of hierarchy. It's really hard to know where to look. This text here is the same size as these numbers here. And because everything is centered, it might not even be centered, honestly, because it looks like the line, I can't draw a line straight here. Because everything is kind of like centered, it's hard for my eye to know where to look. And so everything kind of meshes together. So definitely try to improve the hierarchy of these cards. Okay, so honestly, I'm not really sure why this section is here, the challenges and how the team overcame them. I'm more interested in the problem that you're solving for your project. And so I would probably move this to the bottom if you really want to keep it. I don't think it adds anything to your case study, so you could probably remove it, but otherwise you can put it in the key learning section about how you learn how to work in the designer to developer workflow and stuff like that. But this is honestly more distracting than helpful. I'm going to do a quick scroll through the case study. That's usually what I do first, but I got distracted this time. So, scrolling through the case study, my biggest concern with this case study is that it's extremely hard to follow. So, I do love how you have so many visual artifacts, but the design of the case study itself feels a little bit all over the place. I have a really hard time scanning it and getting a sense of your process because there's a lot of centered aligned things on the page and also there are a lot of competing elements. So I usually recommend against using layouts that are side by side because it's a lot harder to manage. And instead, I'd recommend using a left aligned case study because it's a lot easier to follow and it's also easier for you to design. The first thing I'm noticing is these ginormous cards. I guess one thing that's good about them is that they really do stand out, but unfortunately, this drop shadow is not, it feels way too harsh and it's not super, I would say it feels a little bit dated. And so I'd recommend changing the style of this card a little bit to feel a little bit less different than the rest of the page. The other thing I'm noticing is that the hierarchy of these cards is not effective. So the icon right now is breaking up the text. So usually you want to keep the text together and put the icon outside of it so that the text can all be grouped together. The other thing I'm noticing is that this sentence here could definitely use improvement. Avoid using abbreviations. No one's going to remember that NYR is New Year's resolutions. Also, make sure to use like complete sentences. The so does our effort is kind of like random. And so you might not even need the sentence. How might we transform loss into consistency? It feels extremely random. And so try to edit down your writing and definitely workshop the writing within your case study. Most people won't read things, but they will read the things that are in these boxes up here. And so these are the most important parts. Here's a design I'm not 100% tied to, but maybe instead of something like this, you can simplify it to be something like this so that it's easier to read and has more of a visual focus. Okay, so scrolling down, I think here's an example of a strong type hierarchy. Right now, there's a lot of contrast between this and the sentence here. This is not clear to me that it's a link, so maybe you want to add a visual treatment that makes it feel more like a link. I do like the illustrations in this section. However, again, I would recommend redoing the layout a little bit so that it's a little bit easier to read. Right now, notice how the text is shifting because of the placement of the illustration. So you might want to ground the illustration on the left side or the right side of the card so that it's less distracting in the layout. This is an extremely rough mock-up, but notice how now the image is not breaking up the text and the text is all aligned. And so a design like this makes it a lot easier to read than a design like this where the image breaks up the flow of the text. I also made the hierarchy stronger so that the heading itself stands out more. Right now, the headings are grayed, and so it makes them recede more into the background. Overall, I think you have some great artifacts within the case study. The problem is more around how the work itself is presented. Right now, like scrolling through, there's a lack of headings across the case study. I think having headings like this to ground the case study will go a long way. Like right now, here, feature roadmap is extremely hidden in the background, then user flow is extremely hidden in the background. These really small headings makes everything blend together a lot. The second thing that would really improve it is adjusting the layout on the page so that there's less like back and forth like this. You really want to make sure that it's really easy to scroll through the case study and for me to skim everything. Having things in the center does not help with scannability. And so try redesigning the page so that things are left aligned and that things have equal margins on the left and right sides of the page. Overall, I think this case study has a lot of potential. I highly recommend reading it out loud to make sure that your story is sound and that your story will make sense to someone who's viewing it for the first time. I really love these illustrations, and so I think with some editing, this case study could definitely be really strong. That's all for now. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments below. And if you're interested in an honest portfolio roast from me, please go ahead and let me know.